In the late 16th century, a small island off the coast of what is now North Carolina became the starting point for a story that has held the imagination of generations. More than 100 men, women, and children stepped onto Roanoke's sandy shore, intending to build a new life. When help finally returned, the place they had left behind was empty. No bodies, no signs of battle, only a single carved word etched into wood, a single baffling clue. The Roanoke Colony was England's first serious attempt to plant a permanent settlement in the New World. It was not a careless experiment. It carried hopes, plans, and the weight of political ambition. Sir Walter Raleigh backed the venture. Men and women came with tools, provisions, and a resolve to make a place that would last. They imagined fields, homes, a foothold for English influence across the ocean. But the reality of Roanoke was fragile. The colony would become one of history's oldest unsolved disappearances, a quiet vanishing that left a single word where so many lives had been lived. In 1587, roughly 115 settlers arrived on Roanoke Island. Their leader was John White, an artist by trade and a governor by appointment from the crown. Alongside seasoned men were families, people who carried pots, seeds, and the expectations of entire households. Among them was a child who would come to symbolize the promise of new beginnings, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, and the granddaughter of Governor White. They settled near salt marshes and pine forests, where the rhythms of sea and land set the pace of daily life. The colony was isolated. It relied on supply ships and the tenuous goodwill of neighboring indigenous groups. Survival would depend on trade, careful farming, and the promise that resupply from England would arrive in time. Relations with local indigenous peoples were never simple. There was trade, there was conversation, there was also mistrust and the potential for conflict. Food could be scarce in a young settlement. Crops failed, and foragers pushed into stranger territory. The colonists were aware they stood on unfamiliar ground, and they knew their window for survival was narrow. John White sailed back to England soon after the colony began. His mission was practical: get supplies, bring more settlers, and return quickly. He left behind families, farms, and a fragile sense of hope. He expected to be gone only a few months. England was on the brink of war with Spain. The clash with the Spanish Armada reshaped priorities and resources. Ships were seized, ports closed, and men were pressed to the crown's defense. John White found himself trapped in politics and practicalities, far from Roanoke. Months stretched into a year, and a year into nearly 3 years. Back on Roanoke, the absence of steady supplies forced adaptations. The colonists had arranged with nearby indigenous groups, in particular the Croatoan people, and the two communities navigated an uneasy coexistence. It is important to picture the slow frustrations: stores running low, the constant watching for sales on the horizon, the tightness of every ration. Those were not moments of sudden panic, so much as prolonged anxiety. When John White finally returned in 1590, he expected a thriving settlement, or, at worst, the ruins of a hard-fought life. What he found instead was silence. Houses had been dismantled and removed. There were no bodies, no signs of hurried struggle, and no graves. Instead of ruin, there was an absence, tidy, deliberate, and unnerving. The colony had vanished. On a post where a message had been left, one word was carved: Croatoan. It was clear and deliberate. White had made a plan before he left. If the colonists were forced to move, they were to leave a sign. If they left under duress, threatened, or attacked, they would carve a Maltese cross beside any message. There was no cross beside Croatoan. What does that single word tell us? It points to a nearby island and to an indigenous group the colonists knew as the Croatoan, people who lived along the outer banks. On its face, the carving suggested a planned relocation, an organized movement rather than a flight under attack. The Croatoan people were familiar enough to the settlers that a note directing them there makes sense. It would have been a logical refuge. An island, a short distance away, known paths, and people with whom, at times, the colonists traded and communicated. For some, this fact is the most persuasive clue that the colonists moved voluntarily, perhaps integrating with indigenous groups and continuing their lives in a different form. Yet the question remains, if they left for Croatoan, why is there no trace? Why did later searches fail to uncover clear, consistent evidence of English settlers living among the indigenous communities? Part of the answer is time. Decades and centuries erode wood, scatter artifacts, and blur the lines that might have been obvious to contemporaries. Theories about Roanoke multiply when the facts run out. Over the years, historians and enthusiasts have proposed many different scenarios. One broad group of theories holds that the colonists assimilated with local tribes. Accounts from the following decades report sightings, perhaps English features among indigenous communities, and some suggest that intermarriage and cultural blending took place. These accounts are sporadic and hard to verify. They suggest continuities that are plausible, but they don't offer a firm, documented trail. Another set of ideas points inland. Perhaps the settlers, faced with dwindling food and an uncertain position by the coast, decided to travel upriver, seeking more fertile land or the protection of distant groups. If they went inland, they could have been scattered by geography or absorbed into populations whose records did not survive. There are darker, harder theories too. Some suggest disease decimated the settlement. Others imagine an attack that erased the colony quickly and left no visible trace because the assailants removed evidence. The problem with these scenarios is the lack of physical corroboration. Graves were not found, weapons and battle remnants were scarce, and contemporaneous correspondence is frustratingly thin. Time has been both ally and enemy to the story of Roanoke. Centuries allow perspective and scholarship, but they also wash away the delicate things that would answer questions: wooden posts, small personal effects, and the private stories held in mouth and memory. Acts of neglect compounded the problem. Storms rearranged the shoreline, sea level changes shifted the landscape, and development in later centuries altered the places where evidence might have been preserved. What little physical evidence emerged did so inconclusively. Archaeologists found fragments of English pottery and metalwork in some Outer Banks locations, but context matters. A piece of pottery alone does not prove the presence of a vanished colony. It might have been traded, lost by a visitor, or deposited at a different time. Artifacts offer hints, but they rarely deliver the certainties historians crave. There is a particular kind of silence that follows mysteries like Roanoke, a silence that is not empty, but full of possibility. For some, the lack of violence in the archaeological trace suggests the colonists planned their departure. For others, the odd combination of missing people and missing signs points to slower, less dramatic endings: assimilation, migration, or gradual decline. It is tempting to demand a single answer. The human mind favors tidy conclusions, but Roanoke resists tidy explanation. The colony did not collapse in a single dramatic battle or vanish amid a recorded catastrophe. The evidence we have, the careful dismantling of homes, the absence of cross-marked danger, the carved word Croatoan, suggests something quieter: movement, adaptation, and perhaps a blending that left the English presence indistinct in the record. Consider what it would mean for the settlers to have integrated with indigenous communities. Imagine English names blending with local ones, a mixing of foods and techniques, and a slow, private transformation of identity. In such a scenario, the people of Roanoke would not have been destroyed. Their English colony would have ended, but their lives would have continued in a different form, visible only through subtle markers: a style of pottery, a seam of English grain in a native field. Stories passed quietly across generations. Then imagine the other possibilities: a slow march inland, the steady attrition of disease, or relocation to a more promising place along the coast. None of these paths leaves dramatic traces. They leave small things: bones that scatter and decompose, tools that break and are discarded, names that fade. We must also recognize the limits of the historical archive. The written record can be thin, biased, and accidental. Much of what was not recorded, the everyday choices of women and children, the small negotiations between settlers and neighboring communities, disappears most readily from official documents. The story of Roanoke sits at the edge of what was recorded intentionally. It lives mostly in omissions, and yet the story endures, in part because of what it represents: the fragility of beginnings and the unforeseen consequences of empire and exploration. The colonists came to build permanence. Instead, they became a reminder that history is rarely neat. It is layered with uncertainty, shaped by weather and politics and human choice. Over the centuries, people have traveled these shores, searching for answers. Scholars have excavated, historians have combed the paperwork, and storytellers have woven explanations to fill the gaps. Each new discovery changes the frame slightly, but none have yet produced a definitive closing chapter. Instead, Roanoke remains a set of possibilities, a puzzle made of lived lives rather than neat proofs. The most compelling fact might be the simplicity of what was left behind. No sign of a battle, no grave markers, a carved word without a cross. After more than 400 years, the fate of Roanoke remains unknown in a way few other historical mysteries are. They stepped beyond the reach of recorded history, leaving a quiet, empty place and a single word. The story ends there, for now unresolved, patient, and waiting for whatever footsteps, documents, or artifacts might someday reveal more. This was the last expedition.